Cool. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here if you're joining live, and thank you for taking the time to watch the recording if you're joining us that way. My name's Georgia Carter, if we haven't officially met in the flesh before. And I'm super excited to be sharing this discussion today. It's a bunch of stuff that's been really hot on my heart and really interested me for quite a number of years, and it's the first time that I'm kind of sharing in a more of just a discussion format and just talking about it rather than sharing in the same fashion as with asana. So this is very exciting for me. And a little bit about me: I have been practicing yoga for about 5 years, almost 6 years now. I practiced in the beginning for a few years very diligently Ashtanga Vinyasa, and I had a wonderful teacher in that lineage. And then I went over to India and found Iyengar yoga. I've been practicing in the Iyengar tradition for the last 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years now. And through my Iyengar teacher, who was a direct student of BKS Iyengar for many years, I also study Advaita Vedanta and yoga philosophy with a wonderful teacher named Brahmacharya Siddhartha Krishna. So a lot of the information that I'm going to be sharing today comes from him, and he's someone who is half Indian, half Swiss, but grew up in Rishikesh and studied at a Vedanta monastery from the time that he was like 8 years old or something. So I have studied with people who have been immersed in these traditions and really in the Indian culture, which is where a lot of the yoga traditions come from. And then on the other hand, especially in the last few years, I've been studying a little bit more with modern scholars and like modern historians and Indologists and things like that. So also getting like the factual evidence of what we can say for sure about these traditions and where these teachings came from. Like, what physical proof do we still have that they existed and what they really meant and what they really were trying to achieve. So it's very interesting to me to see the balance of those two worlds. And I hope to share some of that with you today. So I'm just going to see if I can share my screen with you. You can see? You can see? Wonderful. Perfect. Now if I can just... No. No. 1 second. I'm doing. Here it is. There we go. That's the one. Great. So, I'm especially excited to share this because I have a few friends who I know are going to be watching this recording from overseas who might not be familiar with the traditional landowners of Australia. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of this sacred land, this Noongar Budja, upon which I personally live. I want to take this moment to honour the elders, past, present and emerging. And I do encourage you to reflect upon and acknowledge the traditional elders and the traditional custodians of the land upon which you happen to reside, wherever that might be. So, yes, there we go. Just got to admit one more person. Lovely. Perfect. And this is actually, I will just explain, this image that is behind the little acknowledgement is a depiction of Durable Yerrigan, which is the traditional Noongar name for the Swan River, which is the river that runs directly through the middle of Perth, West Australia, where I live. And I very much love it. So thank you for allowing me to share this beautiful piece of culture. And so we begin now by also honoring the traditional creators, the sages, the rishis, who originally imparted this wisdom of yoga to us. So if you practice with me in our physical classes, in physical yoga classes, you'll know, you'll have heard this invocation before. It's quite common in Iyengar yoga classes to chant the invocation to Patanjali. So if you're familiar, I do encourage you to chant along with me. Keep you all on mute though. Otherwise, just listen and absorb. But do feel free to close your eyes and even place your hands into Atmananjali Mudra. So take this moment to allow yourself to be quiet. As we reflect upon this practice, as we take a moment to acknowledge this practice and where it has come from, and surrender ourselves to it, surrender ourselves to the wisdom that it has to share with us. This is one of the purposes for chanting a mantra, to get ourselves out of the way before we begin a course of practice or study or something like this. As always, beginning with 3 Oms. Inhaling as you're ready. Yogena chitasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopa karotam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi avahu purushakaram Shankachakrasitarinam Sahasra Shirasam Svetam Pranamami Patanjalim Hari Om. With an exhalation, surrender your head down towards your heart. Release the palms if you have them in Namaskar. Open the eyes and raise the head. Wonderful. So, whoops. Let me just check in so I can see your faces. Wonderful. Hi, Erin. Nice to see you. Cool. So this mantra, which I often don't get a chance to explain, the meaning behind it. So the literal translation is something akin to salutation to the noblest sage Patanjali, who gave us yoga for serenity of mind, grammar for purity of speech, and medicine for health of the body. I prostrate before Patanjali, whose upper body has a human form, whose arms hold a conch and disc, and who's crowned by a 1,000-headed cobra. O incarnation of Adishesha, my salutations to thee. So this mantra comes from, the earliest historical evidence that we have of this mantra comes from a commentary on the Yoga Sutras by an 11th century king named King Bhoja. This commentary was called the Rajamritanda, and Rajamritanda is like it's a Sanskrit word for like a metric of music, like a meter of music. So that's what Rajamartanda means. And King Bhoja was a very interesting king. He was very philosophically minded, very into the teachings of yoga, and also quite a poet himself and a writer and an author. So in the 11th century, he did write his own commentary on the Yoga Sutras. And so this is according to the earliest historical evidence, right? It comes from the Rajamartanda. But according to Indians that I have met, what they have told me is that, in fact, these verses didn't necessarily come from King Bhoja. He didn't necessarily write them, that they were in existence for a very long time. And in pre-modern Sanskrit literature, it's very common to find like people will take a sloka, people will take a certain section of another text and stick it right into theirs, okay? Plagiarism and copyright did not exist. This was actually a sign of respect and a way for the author to give validity and to corroborate their text and get their point across, right? So there was no like referencing this and that. No, they didn't. So it was not customary for the authors to even put their name on the texts. And the texts were just known to be the texts because they were just universal truths that the authors had received. They weren't to be taken ownership of, right? So these verses were in existence for a very long time, and King Bhoja had plucked them from somewhere, and likely they'd been plucked from somewhere else, likely they'd been plucked from somewhere else. So this is what we come up against quite often when we're dealing with these Sanskrit texts, because they're so old. The Yoga Sutra is from the 5th century. The earliest record of the Yoga Sutra is from the 5th century. They think that it was written around then. But many of these traditions, before they were written down, were oral traditions, for one thing. And the other thing is that we don't really know for sure how long ago people started writing things down. Then they may have very well done for centuries prior, and it just didn't survive. We don't know for sure. So we have to keep a little bit of an open mind towards possibility, I think. Yeah, and we also don't really know like exactly what the customs were and what was really going on during those times. So the Indian traditions say that the first kind of reference to this variation of Patanjali that you see here on the screen, this kind of murti, this is a more modern iconography of Patanjali. And we started to see this emerge around the 13th century. So if the Yoga Sutra was written around the 5th century, yoga probably existed at least for about 1,000 years prior to that. So then around the 13th century, we have this kind of iconography that starts to develop really from South India. The earliest records of this particular murti, this kind of visualization of sage Patanjali, is from around then. And one of the most common stories in India that my Indian teachers shared with me was the story of a yogini named Gonika. And Gonika was desperate for a son. She had tried and tried to get pregnant and she couldn't manage it. So she started to pray to Vishnu. She was a devotee of Vishnu. And every day she was going down to the river nearby where she lived in South India, and she was praying. She was doing her oblations in the river. So there's this custom of picking up the water and offering the water, right? So she was doing her oblations like this to Vishnu. And one day, whilst performing her oblations, out of the sky fell a sun into her Anjali, Atmananjali, Anjali Mudra, Namaskar, right? So the name Patanjali comes from the word Pat in Sanskrit, meaning to descend, and Anjali, meaning Namaskar Mudra. So that's how we get Patanjali, who became Gonika's son. And the legend goes that Gonika was already a supremely accomplished yogi, so much so that she was able to manifest this connection with Vishnu to allow him to grant her a son, right? And so she started to teach him all of the teachings of yoga that she knew. So he was born into a like a yogic family, right? So also the scholars, the modern scholars, take this to be the legend. But if we think about all of the stories of like the Vedas and the Hindu pantheon, and all of the stories like in the Shastras and even the Upanishads, the stories kind of often, especially for sages and saints and rishis, which is what Patanjali was. He was a sage, he was a rishi, which means he was an accomplished yogi. He became like a holy man or an important man, a rishi, a wise man, right? So they kind of have this quite esoteric backstory, but then once they turn into the avatar, Patanjali is the avatar. Once they turn into the avatar, then the avatar has this fairly mundane human existence, you know, like Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. The only part of the Bhagavad Gita that gets quite esoteric is when Krishna shows Arjuna his real form. Other than that, it's simply a dialogue between two friends, between a warrior and a charioteer. So then in Patanjali's human life, he then went on to, he was born into, the legend is, what we can say, we think, is that he was born into a Brahmin family. So Brahmins are like a caste in India. And I'll get to that in a moment, actually. So we can say is that he was born into a Brahmin family. And then during his lifetime, he chose to use his avatar incarnation as Patanjali to really go in search of an experiential understanding of yoga. And through that, through his lifetime and through his search to understand yoga, he ended up leaving us with the Yoga Sutras. Okay, so the other side of this story that I also heard from my Indian teacher is ties into the mantra, where the mantra mentions Adishesha. And so what was happening at the same time that Gonika was praying for his son, more or less the same time, what had also happened in the celestial realm was Lord Vishnu was residing up there with his serpent, Adishesha. So Adishesha is the serpent that is often depicted that Vishnu like lays upon or sits upon, or it's often behind him. And the legend behind that is Adishesha is the serpent. If you can see here, that we have the serpent supporting Vishnu, and then Lakshmi massaging Vishnu's feet, and then out of his navel we have arising Lord Brahma. So after he arises out of Vishnu's navel, Lord Brahma then goes on to create the entire universe, right? So the creation of the entire universe is supported by Adishesha. And this ties into the legend that the creation of our entire universe supported by Patanjali, right? So Adishesha becomes Lord Patanjali. How? Is because at some other moment, Lord Shiva was performing his dance. He was he was Nataraja. He was the Lord of the dance. And Lord Vishnu was completely enraptured watching him dance. He completely went into samadhi watching Lord Shiva as Nataraja performing his dance. And Vishnu's consort Adishesha said, "Oh, how I wish I could please you like that, Master. How I wish I could give you this divine joy. How I wish I could dance for you like that. How I wish I could dance like Shiva." And then Vishnu says, this is paraphrased, mind you, Vishnu says, you have been a loyal and faithful servant, Adishesha, do not worry, your time will come. And then the legend is that then Vishnu sends Adishesha into Gonika's hands. And then Adishesha is transformed into Lord Patanjali, and also throughout his lifetime, besides being on the pursuit of yoga, he also was a beautiful dancer. This is what they say in India. So what can we say historically, for sure, factual evidence, proof that we can find physically about Lord Patanjali, about Sage Patanjali? Not much. Not much is the answer. There is virtually no historical or biographical evidence of a figure named Patanjali outside the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Okay, from the text itself, modern Indologists tell us that it was likely that he was a Brahmin intellectual. He was very learned in Sanskrit, in philosophical Sanskrit, which is, you know, like in English, we have different kinds of styles, different kinds of metric, like there's philosophical Sanskrit, there's poetic Sanskrit, and they all have different rules. Sanskrit is very complex grammatically. As well as Patanjali was for sure very well versed in the Upanishads, in Samkhya and Buddhist philosophies. As well as being a scholar, it was likely, very likely, that he was a practitioner. So not only learned in the scriptures, but he also put them into practice. Now, what is a Brahmin? A Brahmin is a caste in India. They're of the Varna, they're of sect of the Varna caste. And the Varna caste were quite a high caste, mostly pundits and priests and like holy men, wise men, these kinds of things, and keepers of sacred scripture. Sometimes like different sections of the Vedas, certain like sections of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and like really important poems and stuff like that. Different sects of Brahmins kept, or the keepers of these different texts, right? And these different traditions, originally orally. And this is also to note how one of the reasons why we chant the Patanjali mantra in Iyengar classes is because the Iyengar family comes from a Sri Vaishnava Brahmin family, and the Sri Vaishnava sect are really the ones that take this story of Gonika and Patanjali and Vishnu and Adishesha really quite literally, and they're really more of a bhakti sect, so they're more devotional, so they really are devoted to the icons and these beings, which is how we got the icon of this kind of murti of Patanjali out of this South Indian tradition. Now, what is the Yoga Sutra? So broadly speaking, the Yoga Sutra is a philosophical treatise on the nature of the mind, human suffering, and a systematic approach towards attaining complete spiritual freedom, or the isolation of pure consciousness, kaivalya, through the attainment of highly concentrated states of mind, or samadhi. This is a quote from one of my teachers, Seth Powell from Harvard University, and I think this really sums up the text wonderfully. The Yoga Sutra is 4 chapters, 4 partas, discussing different paths to yoga and different methods to attaining the state of yoga, rather, as well as their effects, and really kind of synthesizing not only the practices, the state, and also the effects as well as the goal, the purpose. It's kind of sharing the purpose of yoga. Now also, the Yoga Sutras are not the first and only sutra text. There are many sutra texts like the Mimamsa Sutra, the Brahma Sutra, and it's like a style of writing. It's short aphorisms, short sentences, basically condensing as much information as possible into as small amount as possible, as clearly and succinctly as possible, right? While still communicating the fundamental truth. And the sutras were regarded as a really important form of writing because they are so clever in what they do. They are done well, especially like this. They're really woven together to be multi-layered. And of course, sutra means like a thread. It comes from the same root word in Sanskrit as we have the word sutra in English, to stitch and to sew, right? What is the Yoga Sutra? The Yoga Sutras are the root text for the Yoga Darshana. And the Yoga Darshana means the yoga school, which is a school of Indian philosophy. Okay. There are 6 major orthodox schools of Indian or Hindu philosophy: Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. But within those, of course, there are many different lineages, different streams and different branches underneath all of those. And then there are also 5 major heterodox or Nastika schools, which are the Jains, the Buddhists, the Ajivika, the Anjana, and the Chavraka. And I think out of these 5, it's only the Jains and the Buddhists that had any of their like scriptures or their teachings survive. A lot of the other ones, just we don't really know what their teachings were. There's no scriptures left. So the Yoga Sutras are quite interesting because they are the root text for the yoga school, right? But yoga, Samkhya, Vedanta, even Mimamsa, and Buddhist and Jain, a lot of them draw from the same kinds of earlier texts because they were all happening, they were all forming around the same time. Not all of them, some of them were much earlier, but in particular Vedanta, Mimamsa, Jains, Buddhists, and Sankhya, especially Vedanta and Sankhya and Buddhists, especially around that Gangetic plain in India, in the north of India. In this early, what is it? In the pre-modern era, like the fourth and fifth century, this is when all of these kinds of traditions were forming. And a lot of these traditions, especially the early Shramana traditions, the Jains and the Buddhists, were nomadic and renunciate ascetic traditions. And so they moved around a lot. And so what was happening was that they were coming into contact with one another quite a lot. And so they were sharing kinds of schools of thought, which is why a lot of the early Buddhist texts and Buddhist teachings, as well as yoga teachings and Sankhya teachings, a lot of them are quite similar, and a lot of them use similar language, and like I said, also base their philosophies on these earlier Indian epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, as well as the Upanishads, which were kind of in existence. The Mahabharata, which includes, of course, the Bhagavad Gita, predates the Yoga Sutras, highly likely. So you may have heard that the Yoga Sutras are Raja Yoga You may have heard that they're Ashtanga yoga. You may have also heard that they are Samkhya philosophy. Now, as we saw before, Samkhya is one of the 6 major orthodox schools. Yoga is also one of them. So they are not the same. So they are different. And the Yoga Sutras is the root text for the yoga school. Now, Raja Yoga, this term, the royal path, could have possibly had something to do with the fact that King Boja was very enamored with the Yoga Sutras, and he was quite influential. So it certainly could have had something to do with his influence, or also highly likely it has to do with Swami Vivekananda's book, which talks a lot about the Yoga Sutras, Raja Yoga, and he wrote this book like sometime in the last century or the one before, so really not that long ago, quite modern, Swami Vivekananda. So likely this term was popularized then because it was not used. Patanjali did not use it within the text itself, and it was not used prior to that. Ashtanga yoga is often what we call the yoga of Patanjali. It's sometimes called Patanjali yoga, but often it's called Ashtanga yoga, the yoga of Patanjali, because he really outlined this eightfold system. However, he's not the only one. There are other Sanskrit texts and Buddhist texts that describe this eightfold path. In Buddhist, that's exactly what it's known as, the eightfold path. In yoga, it's the 8-limbed path. And other ones have 6. And the ones that they leave off are the yamas and the niyamas, because likely they were assumed already, didn't have to be clearly stipulated. So prior to the Yoga Sutras, Ashtanga yoga was not used as like a proper noun. Patanjali used and the word was used, Ashtanga yoga, but it was used simply as a descriptor, the eightfold path. And so I just want to quickly note on Sankhya philosophy, because this gets, honestly, it gets a little bit confusing, because a lot of the orthodox traditions, like I said, a lot of them shared information. So what Patanjali kind of did was synthesize a lot of the information that was around in the yogic lineages, which included like the Buddhists, Mimamsa, Jains, and the more aesthetic sects from those traditions, right? And even the Vedanta traditions. So Patanjali does take this metaphysical model of reality from Sankhya, and he does use this as his metaphysical base for understanding like the nature of reality. Okay, so this is how Patanjali defines the nature of reality, which comes from classical Sankhya, and the root text for classical Sankhya is the Sankhya Karika by Ishvara Krishna. So this is how we differentiate yoga and Sankhya, is because they have 2 different root texts, right? And this is why yoga, it gets confusing, because yoga is a little bit different because its root text is really encompassing a lot of the others, and a lot of the other texts that Patanjali draws upon, like I said before, the Upanishads and the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, because there are sections that quite closely parallel what is said there. So he does pull other sources from the same texts that also these other schools use. Like Vedanta also reads the Mahabharata, and it can be read from a Dvaita Vedanta perspective, that is a dualistic perspective, or an Advaita Vedanta perspective, a non-dualistic perspective, and within those there are separate schools and schools and schools, and different lineages have their own separate practices. So we should be very, it requires a bit of thinking and a bit of effort to be clear about what we're talking about. We should not misconstrue a text to be of a certain lineage simply because we have read a commentary or a translation by a commentator or a translator from a certain lineage. Because when people translate and commentate on these ancient texts, which is a little bit becomes Chinese whispers, especially if we're not reading it in the original Sanskrit, especially if we're getting it fed to us in English, it's really easy to have our lenses clouded by someone else's perception and by someone else's judgment. So we should be clear when we're reading a text, and especially if we're reading a translation or a commentary on a text, we should be clear of the tradition that the author comes from, because, for example, Advaita Vedanta does not take this same metaphysical model as Sankhya does. Sankhya is a dualistic system. At the fundamental truth is that there is two. There is Purusha, consciousness, and there is Prakriti, nature, what is seen and what is experienced. And that is externally and internally. So Prakriti is all of nature externally and the nature within ourselves. And then Purusha is that which is watching. Now in Advaita Vedanta, it's a non-dualistic perspective. The fundamental truth to realize is that everything is Brahman, right? Everything is Brahman. Everything that you see outside is Brahman. Everything that you experience inside is Brahman. It's just a different little piece of Brahman. And that's the fundamental truth to realize. And as we'll see a little bit later, Patanjali's idea of realizing and experiencing the fundamental truth of reality is knowing the difference between two different things. So it's a dualistic school. So we should be clear when we're talking in the context of the Yoga Sutras that this is the fundamental truth for Patanjali. As he says, this is the model that he takes. Now, Sankhya and Yoga, and I think this goes for, I included this, I think it's a great quote from the Mahabharata, and I think it goes for all of the schools. And I think it's relevant to what we face in modern yoga, something to nice to remember. So both followers of Sankhya and those of yoga praise their own way as the best. The followers of yoga rely on experiential methods, and those of Sankhya on scriptural interpretation. I consider both these views true, followed according to their instruction. Both lead to the ultimate goal, right? And this is from the Mahabharata. And so there was, even in the time of the Mahabharata, Sankhya and Yoga existed. And so we really don't know how long prior to this they existed for, but this is a good at least 1,000 years prior to the confluence of the Yoga Sutras. And this kind of, this was like a battle that was going on between Sankhya and Yoga. What was right, who was right, which teachings were the best, which ones led to the ultimate goal. And the Mahabharata says both, but I think it's very important to be clear that it says, I consider both these views true, followed according to their instruction. Both lead to the ultimate goal. And in in the Yoga Sutras, in the Hatha Pradipika, many times over and over, especially in the Hatha Pradipika, they're very clear, the author is very clear to explain what they're explaining, and then to say, in the direction of your teacher, as if to know, like, this is just to jot it down, but your teacher will explain it in a way that's best for you. Your teacher will explain it properly in the way that will lead you to the correct understanding, right? Because the teacher is the one that's really imparting like the energy, and the teacher is the one that traditionally, and should be still, the teacher is the one that has experienced the state of yoga or has physically experienced what they are teaching to the students. This doesn't happen so much all the time these days, but this is the way that it was. And this is the way that it should be, because how can you teach something if you have not personally had the experience, right? So the scriptures were very clear about this. And my teacher has always been very clear about this, that it's most useful to have one teacher, to follow one lineage. Otherwise, you get confused, because it's impossible to understand wholeheartedly the context of every single thing, right? And if you miss the context, well, then you've missed half the teaching. So the purpose of the Yoga Sutras was likely directed at male Brahmin ascetics, not ascetics rather, just male Brahmins who were engaged in the practices of Vedic ritual and sacrifice. So likely pundits and priests, pujaris, these kinds of things, and maybe even like scribes, the copiers and the keepers of the sacred scriptures. So what Patanjali did, I like this hypothesis that one of my teachers put forth, is that Patanjali was a bit of a rogue, and that he was kind of not cherry picking, but he was really an ardent practitioner, and he was having the personal experience himself and then trying to share the best way. So like I said before, there are many traditions, there are yogis from many different traditions. We have Buddhist yogis, we have Vedanta yogis, we have Samkhya yogis, all of these things, right? So Patanjali, in a way that's similar, if you know anything about the story of the Buddha, or even if you've just read Hermann Hesse's fabulous little book, Siddhartha, which tells the story quite well, it's quite similar, of this boy who was born as a prince to a wealthy royal family, Brahmin, likely Brahmin family, who then renounced the kingship and went in search of his own truth and his own understanding. Said, I can't really understand just from reading these scriptures, which is the Sankhya way of just reading the scriptures. Svadhyaya, really like self-study, versus the yogic perspective and the more aesthetic traditions, which were really engaged in these practices of like physical practices, meditations, really physically engaged with the body, doing things like this to understand the ultimate truth. And so the Buddha, or Siddhartha, then went to several different Shramana Jain traditions and tried it on, and said, yes, you guys are all talking about the same thing, but none of you are giving me a way to really taste it, to really tangibly experience it. And then it said that after a long time, he then went and sat under the Bodhi tree, and then he developed what we now know as Vipassana meditation. So similar, like I think similar, Patanjali, right? He was having all of these different experiences in the Sankhya tradition, and he was likely born into a Brahmin family. He had access to these teachings, these Brahmin teachings. He was very well versed in, like I said, philosophical Sanskrit, and this was not a common language. The common language was Pali, which is what a lot of the Buddhist literature is written in, right? So Sanskrit was a language of the Brahmins. And Patanjali experienced a lot from the Buddhists. In fact, modern historians are saying that the sutras are actually written in what they're calling Buddhist Sanskrit hybrid, because the references are so close, and the way that Patanjali uses the words are so close to the way that they're used in the Buddhist Sanskrit literature, right? So he really was very deeply influenced by all of these other traditions that were going on around him. And in the Yoga Sutra, he tried to like codify them, tried to bring them all together and really synthesize them and say, this is the point. This is step by step. All of these ways will get you there. And this is what's going to happen to you along the way, right? And likely, judging by some of the language that is used in the sutras, it was a bit of a call to action to these men who were sitting around reading these books and then basically still carrying on being assholes. It's a little bit like what happens today. So, you know, and still engaged in all of these sacrifices, and no one was asking why, like this blind faith. And this is what yoga is completely against. Yoga says, have your own experience. Find out, please, for yourself. Don't just blindly accept what is given to you, right? And Patanjali was saying, hey, like these Buddhists are really, they're not eating meat. They're out here like doing no animal sacrifice, and they're really taking care. Like, look at these Jains. The Jains are renowned for attempting to be like the most peaceful to the point of causing themselves pain. Like they will, even still today, the Jains in India will wear a face covering before it was cool in 2020, so that they walk around in the forest and that they don't get bugs in their mouth and they don't accidentally swallow the bugs. And they also walk around with a little brush sometimes in certain areas, brushing the floor, brushing the little ants and the insects out the way. Okay, so Patanjali was very inspired by these traditions and was saying to these guys, you know, likely his family, his brothers, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Surely this is perpetuating suffering. Surely this is continuing to keep us engaged in the cycle of samsara. Surely this is keeping us bound to the wheel of karma. Surely this is keeping us bound to this reality. And don't we want to understand the fundamental truth, which is what all of these scriptures talk about? It's what is explained by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Don't we want to have this experience for ourselves? And so likely he wrote this in a way to say to these people, hey, maybe if we think about it all in this way, and then maybe if you have your own experience, then maybe you won't want to do some of these other things. Now, understanding the context of the Yoga Sutras, which I think is really very important. And again, my teacher, Seth Powell, gave me this really wonderful graphic that I think explains it just wonderfully. And the two levels of inquiry that we need to have and that we need to consider when dealing with any kind of historical text. And the first level of inquiry should be the historical, the philosophical, the religious, the social context. So what did the Yoga Sutras mean for Patanjali? Who was the audience? What was the purpose? What were the influences around that time? What was the context of literally the language that was used and their background? And then once we've thought about that, then we can move on to our contemporary inquiry, right? As a yoga practitioner or a contemporary person. Why are we bothering with the text? What does it have to offer us? And what does the Yoga Sutras mean for us today? So if we don't take this first level of inquiry and we jump straight to this contemporary level and think, what does the Yoga Sutras mean for us? What does Yoga Sutra 2.2 mean for me today? Then, well, this is just the breeding ground of cultural appropriation. And we might as well be reading like a dishwasher manual if you're just going to take a bunch of words and think, what does this mean for me? Why is it a philosophical text? Why have we even picked it up in the first place? If we're a student of yoga, if we're a student of Ashtanga yoga, which most of us modern practitioners are, whether we know it or not, we are a student of Ashtanga yoga because the Yoga Sutras has likely been introduced in your teacher training if you're a teacher. And likely the Eightfold Path, the Eight-Limb Path was really highlighted as being quite important. The yamas and the niyamas were quite important. And if we don't think about what Patanjali was actually trying to say, or what the context of any text was, what the author was really trying to say, then we've missed the teaching. Then we haven't grasped the truth of the teaching. So we've lost satya. We are no longer with the yamas and the niyamas. We're no longer on the 8-limbed path. We're no longer heading in the direction of yoga, right? And this is potentially worse than the cultural appropriation, because then we're just doing things for no reason. Why am I listening to half a teaching and not the other half, right? It has no depth, it has no substance. So it's really important that we consider from time to time, that we really consider and understand, especially in the beginning, what Patanjali was trying to say, what he meant, and especially because it was written in a language that is not our own, and we are relying heavily on translations and commentaries, and a lot also from Western people nowadays. So there's a lot of Chinese whispers happening. And also the historical context and the real teachings, they're very interesting. They're very interesting. It's very in-depth, but it's very interesting. So it's really worth remembering that this is an important point, okay? And when it comes to understanding the Yoga Sutras and their context, the best point of reference that we have is known as the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Maybe you've heard this term before, maybe not. And the Patanjali Yoga Shastra is the Yoga Sutras, which on their own is 165 aphorisms. It's very small. It's really quite small. I wish I had a small copy to show you, but I don't. And then the Bhashya. The Bhashya of Vyasa, known as just the Bhashya. Bhashya means commentary in Sanskrit, but this is such an important one that it has become known as the Bhashya. The Yoga Sutras and the Bhashya of Vyasa together become Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Okay, and this is the earliest Sanskrit commentary that we have a record of on the Yoga Sutras. And in fact, traditionally, sutra texts come with a Bhashya. The Yoga Sutras did not. It is speculated that the Bhashya was written or composed about 100 years later. But then again, if we are students of yoga, I think we need to, if we really are students of yoga, I think we need to allow ourselves to be open with our perspective that in these teachings, these yogis, these rishis, these sages, they were accomplished in yoga. They had accomplished certain powers, certain siddhis. And one of those, as Patanjali describes in the chapter on the siddhis, on the yogic powers, is the ability to master time, right? So there's really a potential that these beings were in existence for hundreds of years. And these commentaries were written by one person 100 years later. Who knows? But if we are students of yoga, we should take this into account, that this is the teaching. And as I said before, if we're going to take a truth of the teaching, we should not take half a truth. We should take the whole truth. And in the keeping with the tradition of yoga, we should test it out. We should test it out to the best of our ability. We should test it out if it's true for us, okay? And in any case, this Bhashya became so important, this commentary became so important, that after this, the earliest Sanskrit commentators after this all comment on these two texts together. They comment on the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So they're basing their commentary off what is explained in the Bhashya of Vyasa. And like I was saying, some people say it's not known. Some people say that it's a different Vyasa. Some people say it's the same Vyasa as the narrator of the Mahabharata, right? These beings, we don't know. But also in India, it's common to name people after sages and saints and things like this. So who knows? Let me just add one more person in. So this Patanjali Yoga Shastra gives us our best context in any case historically, because it's the closest to the earliest reference that we have of the Yoga Sutras. So hopefully, there we go. Hopefully, we have to assume that this Vyasa, whoever wrote this Bhasha, had the closest understanding to what Patanjali meant in the Yoga Sutras with his use of Sanskrit, what he meant by the words that he chose, because the sutras are a text that need to be traditionally sutras are a form of text that are understood with a teacher, right? And what the Bhasha does is give a glossary, like a literal, like this is what this is meant by this Sanskrit term, and also then the author's own commentary. So the Vyasa, who wrote this Bhasha, gives a like a glossary for the Sanskrit terms, and then also his own commentary. And then the commentators after him really appreciate what he had to say. This is quite a good, very good, in fact, translation by Swami Harananda Aranya. You can get this in English in PDF. Okay, it's very good. And these are some of the other translations, like important, not translations, rather important early commentaries. Okay, so we had the Bhasha, and then after that we had one by Shankara Vashaspati Mishra. Then we had in the 11th century King Bhoja, Yoga Vartika, Yoga Siddhanta Karika, and then we have Swami Harananda Aranya in the 20th century. So that's why I mentioned this translation and commentary by Swami Harananda Aranya, because he comments on the original Sanskrit text, and he had a very interesting life, and he was a ascetic for his final years. He retreated into a cave and physically tried on all of these practices, but from fairly recently, just the 20th century. So he's quite an interesting figure, because he has quite similar language to the language that we speak in. So it's a very interesting perspective. And yes, you can get this on PDF. So I recommend having a look at that if you're interested in checking out the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. Now, what is yoga for Patanjali? He tells us, he straight up tells us in the second sutra, yoga is the stilling of the turnings of the mind. And this is a translation from my teacher, Seth Powell. I think he has a really wonderful translation of the sutras, very direct and very close to the Sanskrit, because what we see often is lots of translators take their own poetic license, and in their translation they don't give a very direct translation. They often give their own interpretation. So the word might be something else, but they will say like, oh, the author is, he really means this, so I'll use this word instead. One of my favorite translations, actually, which I have here, it's going to be backwards surely for you, but it's the Light on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by Iyengar. I love this translation and this Bhasha, this commentary, because he references a lot things that are relevant to us as physical yoga practitioners, as hatha yoga practitioners, right? But he does take a lot of poetic license. So if you're reading it for the translation of the sutras, not the best. Okay, so this is a good translation for direct Sanskrit. Seth is a student of Sanskrit also. So it's quite simple. Patanjali tells us what yoga is for him. What is yoga? It's not always what we hear today, right? Eventually, sometimes we get there. Someone's quoting this specific sutra, but often we hear yoga is union. Yoga is union of the body and the breath and the mind. Yoga is union of the self and the ultimate self. Yoga is union of the self and God. And this is true. This is true. Yoga does mean union in certain contexts, right? And so we have to be careful not to confuse the context. and not to take the context of another text, for instance, like the Mahabharata or something else that is more of like a, I don't know, more of a devotional text. And we shouldn't take that understanding and impose that onto the Yoga Sutras in this case, or any text in that case. So what is yoga for Patanjali? Yoga is the stilling of the turnings of the mind. Very simple. Now, if we turn to the Bhashya, on the first sutra, Sutra 1.1, Atta Yoga Anushasanam. Now, the exposition on yoga. The Bhashya says, the word Atta indicates the commencement of a subject which is under discussion. It is to be understood that the Shastra dealing with the regulations relating to yoga is now going to be explained. Yoga means concentration. So what he did here was take the word Atta and the word yoga and give like a glossary on those two terms. The way that the Yoga Sutras start is common in sutra texts. The Brahma Sutras, the Mimamsa Sutras also start like this, like Atta, now then, indicates the commencement of a subject. This was a common trend, right? And here we see quite clearly the Bhashya, which all commentators after take to have a right or a good understanding, says yoga means concentration. In fact, the original Sanskrit in the Bhashya says yogaha samadhihi, right? And that just means yoga is samadhi. In this English translation, samadhi has been translated as concentration. So in the Bhashya, very clearly on the first sutra, it says yoga means samadhi. So for Patanjali, yoga is synonymous to the word samadhi, right? So this is really a key understanding as you start to unpack the sutras, to know that these two terms are interchangeable. And what we know is that samadhi is a state of concentration, right? That's what it says in the 8 limbs, blah, 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 blah. Samadhi is a state of concentration. So yoga is a state to be experienced, right? It's not an action to be performed. Today we say, I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to practice yoga. I'm going to, you know, right? It's not like, you know, it's like walking down the street. That's not like quite often we hear today. It's all yoga. Yoga, the state of yoga can be experienced in anything. And this is what this means by it can all be yoga. The state of yoga can be experienced in any action, in any activity. And this is the teaching of the yoga in the Gita, right? Of karma yoga, the yoga of action. But it is not the action itself. Walking down the street is not yoga. Otherwise, everyone would be enlightened. But you can be in a state of yoga whilst walking down the street. But the physical act of walking down the street is not yoga. And this is something that we should be very clear about, because this is how we get confused. And then we think we're doing something and we're doing something else. And then we're completely in Maya. We're in delusion. We are not with truth. We are not in the present reality. And the teachings of yoga are all about, no matter what tradition, are all about penetrating the ultimate reality and experiencing the ultimate reality, right? And through this experience, we eradicate our avidya, our suffering, our ignorance rather, our fundamental suffering. So I want to explain a little bit about yoga in the context of union, just quickly. Yoga does mean union in certain contexts, but we also have this in English where in certain contexts, different words mean different things, you know, like cool, that's cool, it's really good, cool, it's very cold, right? So yoga, the root of one of the meanings of yoga, the root word does come from yuj, which does mean to join, which does mean to unite. But in the context of the Yoga Sutras, the way that Patanjali uses yoga meaning union is he uses this word samyoga, which literally means a connection, which means a joining, right? And so in 2.17, Patanjali says, the conjunction between the seer and what is seen is the cause of suffering to be avoided. Drashtayo samyago heya heyatuhu, right? Samyogo. This samyoga, this conjunction between the seer and what is seen. And if we go back to Patanjali's fundamental understanding of the nature of reality, the seer and what is seen is Purusha, the seer, and Prakriti. And Patanjali is trying to get to the fundamental truth, which is the separation of these two. And he carries on in 2.23 to say that the conjunction, this samyoga, is the cause for understanding the essential nature of the powers of the possessed, which is the buddhi, and the possessor, the seer. So that is to say that this samyoga is the problem and the solution. So it's not good or bad, it's the problem and the solution. This conjunction is the cause of this fundamental ignorance, this avidya. This conjunction is the cause of ignorance, which is the fundamental first root cause of all suffering, from out of which all other suffering arises, which is ignorance. Through this conjunction, we understand that we have been ignorant. And through this conjunction, we understand that there is a difference. And through this conjunction, we're able to understand and differentiate between the seer and what is seen. So between the seer and the buddhi, the seer and the mind, the purusha and the prakriti, because the prakriti is what is seen externally and what is seen and experienced internally, right? So what Patanjali is calling for really is a V-yoga. Samyoga is a joining and a V-yoga is a disjoining. So in order to experience the fundamental truth of reality, which is that Purusha and Prakriti are separate, there needs to be a V-yoga. There needs to be a separation. And then it is through this separation that we destroy our fundamental ignorance, that we destroy and break through our avidya, and that we then are free from suffering. And if we go back to the quote at the beginning, this text is really an exposition on the nature of the human mind and the nature of suffering, which is a fundamentally Buddhist idea, might I just say. Then in that case, that's what we want, is to eliminate this suffering. And for Patanjali, that means creating a V-yoga, a separation, not a union. So for Patanjali, he explicitly says yoga is the stilling of the turnings of the mind. And what is that state when the mind is still, when the turnings have stilled? That state is samadhi. That state is a high state of concentration, right? So it's very simple. So that's all I want to share with you. So when you next pick up a copy of the Yoga Sutras, you keep this in your mind, that whoever you're reading the translation by, that you keep this in your mind, that Patanjali's fundamental understanding of the nature of reality is taken from the Sankhya philosophy. And he explicitly says in Sutra 1.2, yoga is the stilling of the turnings of the mind. And if so far, like all of the earliest Sanskrit commentators really hold in high esteem the Bhashya and hold in high esteem what this author Vyasa had to say in the Bhashya. And even as modern, in terms of modern historians and modern scholars, it's the closest thing we have to really understanding what he meant. And in the Bhashya, it explicitly says that yoga and samadhi are synonyms. So whenever we see yoga and whenever we see samadhi, we should know that they mean one and the same. And this is what yoga meant for Patanjali. And this is the fundamental understanding that supports the yoga darshana, the yoga school, as in the school, one of the 6 main orthodox schools in India. So this is the context that we should be aware of. And we should remember when we're relating to the Yoga Sutras, first and foremost. And then once we've understood that, once we have done our best to really grasp that, then we are free to ask, what does it mean for us? What's the point of even looking at it? You know, what helped and what relevance does it have to me today? And then our answers to those questions also have more depth and more validity, and we get more out of them. So that's all. That's really what I wanted to share with you today.